June 1942, Western Pacific. A lone Grumman F4F Wildcat struggled to maintain altitude as three Mitsubishi A6M Zeros circled above like sharks sensing blood. The American pilot had perhaps 30 seconds to live unless he remembered what Lieutenant Commander Thatch had taught him during those hasty briefings at Pearl Harbor. The Zero pilots expected him to turn and fight, to engage in the swirling dogfight where their aircraft excelled. Instead, he did something the Japanese had never encountered. He dove straight down using gravity and the Wildcat's superior diving characteristics to accelerate beyond what the lighter Zero could safely match. Within seconds he had escaped, bleeding speed back into altitude for another pass. What happened next would define the Pacific Air War for the next 3 years. Two aircraft, both carrier-based fighters, locked in a struggle that would determine naval supremacy across the world's largest ocean. One was lighter, more maneuverable, and had dominated every opponent it faced since its combat debut over China. The other was slower, less agile, but built like a tank and armed with devastating firepower. On paper, the contest wasn't even close. Japanese pilots laughed when they first encountered the stubby American fighter. In reality, the mathematics of aerial combat proved far more complex than performance specifications suggested. This is not about declaring a winner. This is about understanding what made these machines legendary and why pilots on both sides learned to respect their opponent's capabilities while exploiting their weaknesses. The Mitsubishi A6M model 210 represented Japan's pinnacle of fighter design in 1941. Its Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine produced just under 1,000 horsepower, seemingly modest power that had to move remarkably little mass. Empty, the Zero weighed 3,700 pounds. Fully loaded for combat, it reached only 5,300 pounds. This featherweight construction delivered extraordinary performance that shocked Allied intelligence when reports first arrived from China. The Zero could outturn virtually any opponent, its tight turning radius becoming legendary among pilots who faced it. It climbed to altitudes that left enemy fighters gasping in thin air. Its disputed top speed hovered around 330 miles per hour at optimal altitude, though pilots reported variations depending on altitude, aircraft condition, and individual engine performance. What wasn't disputed was the service ceiling of 37,000 feet and the staggering operational range of 1,160 miles without external tanks. With drop tanks attached, a Zero could fly missions exceeding 1,900 miles, capabilities that seemed impossible to Allied intelligence officers reading the reports. They assumed Japanese propaganda had inflated the numbers. They were wrong. The armament reflected Japanese tactical philosophy developed during years of combat over China. Two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns mounted in the engine, cowling provided consistent fire for longer engagements. Two 20mm Type 99 cannons in the wings delivered devastating punch, capable of destroying bombers with single, well-placed hits. The cannons carried only 60 rounds each, forcing pilots to make every burst count during the brief seconds of firing time available. This combination of rifle-caliber machine guns and powerful cannons created tactical dilemmas for Zero pilots. Machine guns could fire longer but lacked stopping power against rugged American aircraft. Cannons could destroy bombers with single hits but depleted ammunition after mere seconds of sustained fire. Zero pilots learned to close to point-blank range, fire short, carefully aimed bursts, and disengage before their precious ammunition vanished. The limited cannon ammunition became a critical weakness during extended combat over Guadalcanal, where pilots often expended their shells during initial passes and spent the rest of the engagement with only their light machine guns. The Grumman F4F Wildcat couldn't match these specifications on paper. Its Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin-wasp radial engine produced 1,200 horsepower, 50% more than the Zero's engine. Yet the Wildcat achieved only 318 miles per hour maximum speed, slower than its opponent despite the substantial power advantage. The reason became obvious when examining the airframe. Empty weight reached 5,700 pounds. Combat loaded with full fuel, ammunition and pilot, the Wildcat could exceed 8,000 pounds, more than 50% heavier than a Zero carrying similar loadouts. This mass came with advantages that wouldn't become apparent until bullets started flying and aircraft started burning. The Wildcat featured armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb hits without catastrophic fires, and rugged construction throughout the airframe. It was built to absorb punishment and bring its pilot home. Multiple Wildcats returned to carriers with dozens of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, and wounded pilots but still flying. This survivability came at a cost that planners accepted reluctantly. Range suffered dramatically under this weight. Maximum operational range reached 770 miles, barely two-thirds what the Zero could manage under similar conditions. This disadvantage would prove critical during the campaign for Guadalcanal, where Japanese fighters based at Rabaul could reach the battlefield, while American fighters depended on carriers positioned closer or primitive airfields carved from jungle. The limited range forced American carriers to operate within range of Japanese land-based bombers, exposing them to constant danger. It also meant Wildcat pilots fighting over Guadalcanal operated near their maximum range, unable to pursue retreating Japanese formations that could fly hundreds of miles further. The Wildcat's armament philosophy differed fundamentally from Japanese thinking. 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, provided consistent, reliable firepower that pilots learned to trust absolutely. Each gun carried 450 rounds, allowing sustained fire that pilots appreciated during extended combat when multiple targets appeared. The Browning M2 was arguably the finest aircraft machine gun of World War II. Reliable under extreme conditions, powerful enough to damage aircraft structure and disable engines, and available in quantities that seemed limitless to Japanese observers. While lacking the Zero's cannon punch, the concentrated fire from 650s could soar through airframes when pilots held their aim steady for 2 or 3 seconds. Multiple hits from 50 caliber rounds could disable engines, shred control surfaces, start fires, and kill pilots. The key was hitting the target repeatedly, something the Wildcat's stable gun platform enabled better than the Zero's lighter, more responsive structure that bounced under recoil. Understanding these aircraft requires understanding how their nations employed them in combat. Japanese fighter doctrine had evolved from rigid formations to more flexible arrangements by 1941. The traditional Shotai formation placed 3 aircraft in a tight V, visually impressive but tactically limiting when combat began. By the time war began, Japanese squadrons were transitioning to looser formations, with staggered wingmen positioned for mutual support. This gave lead pilots more freedom to maneuver aggressively, while wingmen provided security against threats. The system worked brilliantly when pilots possessed the training and experience to execute these fluid tactics without constant radio communication. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviators averaged 600 to 800 flight hours before entering combat, with many veterans having fought over China since 1937. This extraordinary experience level made Japanese fighter units devastatingly effective during the war's first year. American doctrine lagged dangerously behind reality at the war's beginning. Navy fighter squadrons still trained for the Vic formation, 3 aircraft in tight V-shaped spacing that looked impressive during air shows and fleet reviews, but collapsed under combat stress. Pilots focused on individual dogfighting skills, emphasizing tight turns and aerobatic maneuvers learned during peacetime training. The problem became obvious once they encountered Zeros over the Pacific. American pilots had 200 to 350 flight hours total, only a fraction in fighters, with almost no combat experience. They tried to outturn Zeros and died. They chased Zeros into climbs and stalled out at altitude while Japanese pilots circled above. They engaged in swirling dogfights where Japanese experience and aircraft capabilities dominated completely. The first 6 months of the Pacific War proved catastrophic for American fighter pilots, attempting to fight on Japanese terms using Japanese tactics. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch understood the problem before firing a shot in combat. Intelligence reports from China described the Zero's capabilities in disturbing detail: exceptional maneuverability in turns, rapid climb rate exceeding American fighters, combat radius exceeding any Allied fighter by hundreds of miles. Thatch spent evenings pushing matches around his kitchen table, simulating aerial combat between formations of Wildcats and Zeros. He needed tactics that transformed the Wildcats' disadvantages into advantages. What emerged became known as the Thatch Weave. 2 Wildcats would fly parallel courses separated by approximately the Wildcat's turning radius. When Zeros attacked one Wildcat, both American fighters would turn toward each other, crossing paths. The Zero pilot, fixated on his target, would suddenly find the second Wildcat crossing in front, guns blazing at point-blank range. If he broke off the attack, his target escaped. If he pressed the attack, the second Wildcat killed him. The maneuver forced Zeros into head-on gunnery passes, exactly the scenario where the Wildcat's superior firepower and rugged construction mattered most. James Flatley, another tactical innovator, emphasized different principles that proved equally crucial. Never dogfight a Zero. Never try to outturn it at any altitude. Never climb with it below 15,000 feet where it held overwhelming advantage. Instead, maintain altitude advantage of at least 2,000 feet when possible. Dive on targets from above, fire during the high-speed pass, and use the Wildcat's superior diving speed to zoom back to altitude before Zeros could react. These hit-and-run tactics frustrated Zero pilots who wanted turning fights where their skills dominated. American pilots who followed these rules survived their first combats. Those who forgot died within minutes. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided the first major test. Wildcat pilots shot down approximately 14 Zeros while losing 10 Wildcats in fighter-versus-fighter combat. Not a victory by traditional measures, but not the catastrophe many had feared given the Zero's reputation. Midway in June showed clear improvement. Squadrons using Thatch's and Flatley's tactics achieved rough parity or better. Those still employing old Doctrines suffered heavy losses that decimated squadrons. The mathematics of combat were shifting as American pilots learned and adapted faster than their opponents realized. The campaign for Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 1943 became the crucible where tactics solidified into doctrine. Marine and Navy Wildcats based at Henderson Field faced daily raids by Zeros flying from Rabaul, 550 miles away. The Japanese advantage in range met the American advantage in warning time. Coast watchers positioned throughout the Solomons radioed when raids departed Rabaul. Radar provided precise timing and altitude. Wildcats scrambled early, climbing to altitude well above the predicted Japanese approach path. When Zeros arrived after their long flight, often low on fuel, Wildcats dove from above, made high-speed passes, and escaped before the Japanese could respond effectively. Zero pilots, critically low on fuel after the long mission, couldn't pursue. They fought defensively, exactly the tactical reversal Americans desperately needed. Statistics tell the transformation story clearly. During the initial phase from August to November 1942, Wildcats and Zeros traded losses nearly 1-for-1. By February 1943, Wildcats were destroying nearly 6 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. By war's end, that ratio reached nearly 7-to-1. The aircraft hadn't changed significantly. Tactics had evolved dramatically. Pilot training had improved substantially. Most critically, American pilots survived their first combats in Wildcats rugged enough to bring them home despite battle damage that would have killed Zero pilots. Japanese pilots in Zeros often died in aircraft that caught fire from single hits to unprotected fuel tanks. Over months, American squadrons accumulated experienced pilots, while Japanese units constantly replaced losses with less trained replacements who lacked the skills of the original veterans. The captured Zero from Akutan Island in the Aleutians provided crucial technical intelligence that confirmed combat observations. In June 1942, a Zero pilot attempted an emergency landing on Akutan after his aircraft suffered damage during the Dutch harbour raid. The landing failed, killing the pilot, but the aircraft remained structurally intact. American forces recovered it in July, shipped it to San Diego, and rebuilt it to flying condition by September. Test pilots flew the Zero extensively, documenting every characteristic. Intelligence Summary Number 85 distributed the results throughout the fleet in November. The document confirmed what combat pilots had reported. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange the Wildcat in those specific categories, but it also revealed critical weaknesses that tactics could exploit. Above 300 miles per hour, the Zero became increasingly difficult to control. Maneuverability declined sharply at high speeds. The aircraft couldn't perform negative G maneuvers well, struggling during pushover dives that American pilots could execute easily. Most importantly, the Wildcat could match the Zero's diving speed, enabling American pilots to disengage when necessary. Armed with technical data confirming tactical observations, doctrine solidified throughout Pacific squadrons. Wildcat sections would maintain 2,000 feet altitude advantage when possible. They would attack in coordinated pairs, never alone where Zeros could isolate them. They would concentrate fire on single targets rather than spreading out. They would use diving attacks, zoom climbs, and mutual support constantly. They would never, under any circumstances, attempt to turn with Zeros at low speeds. These weren't suggestions for consideration. They were requirements for survival. The human factor ultimately decided the contest. Aircraft performance mattered less than pilot skill, training quality, tactical discipline, and institutional learning. Japanese pilots entered the war with extraordinary training but faced unsustainable attrition rates. Training a replacement pilot to the same standard required 2 years, time Japan didn't have as losses mounted. As veteran pilots died in aircraft without adequate protection, overall quality declined steadily. American training programs, initially inadequate, improved continuously throughout the war. Flight hours increased from 300 to over 600. Gunnery training intensified with realistic combat scenarios. Tactical instruction included lessons from the latest combat reports arriving weekly. New pilots arrived in combat units better prepared than their predecessors, closing the experience gap. By late 1943, new American fighters arrived that could match or exceed the Zero's performance across all categories. The F6F Hellcat combined speed, firepower, and durability in a package that finally gave American pilots aircraft superior to the Zero in every measurable way. The F4U Corsair provided even better performance with speed exceeding 400 miles per hour. But these aircraft succeeded partly because Wildcat pilots had already established tactical doctrine and training programs that exploited enemy weaknesses systematically. They proved that inferior aircraft flown with superior tactics by adequately trained pilots could defeat superior aircraft flown with conventional tactics by even experienced pilots. Statistical evidence from the Solomons campaign between February 1943 and February 1944 demonstrates this complete transformation. Japanese forces lost approximately 600 1-0s destroyed in combat. American forces lost 486 total aircraft to all causes, including operational accidents and non-combat losses. The Zero, which had dominated Pacific skies for 18 months, was being systematically defeated by combinations of tactics, training, and teamwork that overcame its technical advantages completely. The A6M Zero versus F4F Wildcat contest wasn't fair in any traditional sense. One aircraft was faster in level flight, more maneuverable in turns, and longer ranged for extended missions. The other was tougher, better armed with consistent firepower, and supported by superior doctrine that evolved continuously. Declaring a winner misses the point entirely. The Zero was probably the better pure fighter aircraft when flown by experienced pilots with tactical freedom in turning engagements. The Wildcat was the better weapons system when integrated into coordinated tactical formations, supported by early warning systems and continuous improvement of doctrine based on combat experience. Wars are not won by the best individual aircraft, but by the best overall systems for training pilots, developing tactics, learning from experience, and supporting operations effectively. The pilots who flew these aircraft understood this distinction clearly. They respected their opponents, both the machines and the men who flew them into combat. Zero pilots appreciated the Wildcat's toughness and concentrated firepower that could destroy their fragile aircraft. Wildcat pilots acknowledged the Zero's maneuverability and range that created tactical challenges. What mattered wasn't which aircraft was objectively better in specifications, but how effectively each side employed their tools. The Zero remained a formidable opponent throughout the war when flown properly. The Wildcat remained effective long after newer fighters had replaced it in frontline service. Both aircraft earned their legendary status through the courage and skill of the pilots who flew them into combat day after day, knowing their lives depended on understanding their machine's capabilities and their opponent's weaknesses. That understanding, more than horsepower or wing loading or armament specifications, determined who survived and who died in the vast emptiness of the Pacific sky.